The United States has eased sanctions on Iran, authorizing the sale of Iranian oil and petrochemical products until August 21st. The move comes as Washington and Tehran continue negotiations on a final agreement in Switzerland. The Treasury says the decision follows Iranian commitments to allow international nuclear inspections and ensure free passage through the Strait of Hormuz. The temporary 60-day license marks a significant shift in relations between the two countries after decades of restrictions. We're live in the Strait of Hormuz this hour, but also in Washington, D.C. We start with Mike Hanna, who's at the White House for us. So, Mike, the U.S. pausing oil sanctions for 60 days. Is this an initial step to lifting other sanctions on Iran?
Well, it's all going to depend on the process, and it's all going to depend on what the U.S. defines as Iranian compliance. Now, this announcement of the waiver of the sanctions on the export of Iranian oil was announced by the Treasury Secretary, and this is what he said in a social media message. In line with the ongoing productive talks in Switzerland, Iran has committed to free and open transit in the Strait of Hormuz and to permit IAEA inspectors into their country. As part of the framework, he continues, Treasury has issued a temporary 60-day general license authorizing the production, delivery and sale of Iranian oil. Now, why I read all of this out is because it shows very clearly how this process is designed to go. In terms of the Memorandum of Understanding, the Strait of Hormuz would be opened immediately, sanctions, the waiver on sanctions would be issued, and these happen simultaneously. So the U.S. has recognized the opening of the Strait of Hormuz by formally imposing that waiver on the export of Iranian oil. And this is how it would be expected to go as you go along. And if the answer to the question about wider sanctions, that is linked to nuclear negotiations very clearly in the Memorandum of Understanding. As there is progress in terms of reaching an agreement on the nuclear issue, there will be an ongoing lifting of Iranian sanctions. So everything is linked in this. It all depends on what the U.S. decides is Iranian compliance, and it all depends on how smoothly the process goes and how much the U.S. and Iran meet the terms of the Memorandum of Understanding.
As you say, very important to point out that everything is indeed linked. Let's go to the Strait of Hormuz, Mike, and speak to Tawhid Asadi, who's there for us. So Tehran, Tawhid, committing to keeping the strait open. What is the status right now of Hormuz, and what will happen after 60 days of negotiations?
Well, actually, after the announcement of a Memorandum of Understanding, Tehran announced that it's going to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And indeed, it was open. And we saw a limited number of ships and vessels and oil tankers transiting through this geostrategically significant choke point. But starting from Saturday and following the continuation of the Israeli aggressions on the Lebanese territories, Iran's Revolutionary Guards came out with a statement to close the Strait of Hormuz, saying that ships and vessels should not approach the strait, and if they approach, they jeopardize their safety and security. And then another message came from the joint military headquarters of Khatamul Anbiya, saying that it is a response to the American failure to fulfill their commitments under the Memorandum of Understanding to put an end on the war in general and in Lebanon in particular. And also they asked for the stopping of the Israeli attacks on the Lebanese territories. And also they said that the closure of the strait, something that is currently happening, is a result of is actually a first step, and there might be other steps on the horizon if the Israeli attacks continue. All in all, the situation at the strait looks very brutal. The spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs after the talks in Switzerland came out to say that there are some mechanisms and procedures being considered to actually reopen the strait, but that all is going to be dependent on the fulfillment of the commitments by the other parties, including the Americans and obviously the Israelis, to stop their attacks on Lebanese territories. And also, we have to keep in mind that we're dealing with a network of intricate points of contention in that regard when it comes to the U.S. naval blockade. And in the Strait of Hormuz, I can say that specifically in the Shahid Rajai port, the largest commercial port in Iran, we had reports starting from past 24 hours, at least 2 ships have found their ways to that port, meaning that a sort of, I would say, lifting of the naval blockade. But we are aware pretty much that there are other sticking points when it comes to the frozen assets, the secondary and primary sanctions, the war reparations, and most importantly, the security assurances that Iran is demanding. This was the first step.
And those other issues in a moment, Tawhid. We'll come to those issues in another moment. I just want to bring our viewers up to date first with what's unfolded in Switzerland, because we heard from the U.S. Vice President earlier saying that significant progress had been made in the talks with the Iranians in Switzerland. He describes the discussions as a good foundation for a successful final deal to end the war. Let's listen to that.
Yesterday was a very, very good day. We made a lot of good progress. We did exactly what we wanted to do, which is accomplish 4 things for the American people. First, we wanted to build a mechanism for keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. It is open. We've seen, of course, gas prices and oil prices come down, millions and millions of barrels of crude and natural gas flowing through the Strait of Hormuz that weren't flowing before. But we also wanted to make sure that we actually set up the coordination mechanism so that we could demine the Straits of Hormuz.
Well, Qatar, along with Pakistan, has been mediating those talks. Speaking to Al Jazeera, Qatar's Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Mohammed bin Abdurrahman Al Thani said the initial understandings reached by both sides have helped halt the fighting and create a foundation for broader negotiations.
First of all, that this round of negotiation, it was important, very important to take place as soon as the memorandum is signed. And the purpose of the objective of these meetings is to lay the foundation for the negotiation moving forward.
Mike Hanna at the White House, let me come back to you. We heard some very upbeat statements, notably from Vice President J.D. Vance, about what was achieved in Switzerland. But as we've said, the real work begins now. What is the Trump administration going to be prioritizing in the technical talks?
Well, top of the list will probably be discussion about the nuclear issue. Now, it's very important that Iran has agreed to International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors going in. Now, one of the ideas that the U.S. had floated is with the enriched uranium that it be downgraded on site under the supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency. That was a suggestion. That is something that is going to be discussed, and that is probably very close to the top of the discussion list, because the ultimate aim, President Trump has stated repeatedly, is to get complete assurance and guarantee that Iran will not develop a nuclear weapon, which it has pledged not to do. Well, it pledged back in the 1970s that it would not, but now it has done so again in the Memorandum of Understanding. Other issues will be linked to that. The issue of sanctions, which will be discussed. The Strait of Hormuz, which will be discussed. Remembering that in the Memorandum of Understanding, Iran has pledged to keep the strait open for a 60-day period. But what has got to be discussed is what happens after that 60-day period. Will there be tolls? Will there not be? All of these issues will be discussed. But in terms of priorities, that nuclear issue is probably top of the list.
Mike Hanna at the White House, thank you very much for that, Mike. Tawhid, let me come back to you. I imagine top of the list for Iran is the unfreezing of its assets. Washington has suggested that unfrozen assets would be channeled into specific purchases like food imports. Would Iran accept those conditions?
Well, according to what we heard from the governor of the Central Bank of Iran, there was some complicated discussion taking place in Switzerland in that regard. Agreements reached. However, he said that the gradual release of the frozen assets of the country is going to take place in the coming days. And also he said that it's going to be up to the central bank to make decisions and provide necessary measures to spend those frozen assets. And starting from the very first day of negotiations, we know that we were talking about the release of between $6 to $25 billion of Iran's frozen assets. And that's just part of it, because we know that an estimated number of $100 to $120 billion of the Iranian assets has been frozen in different international accounts. And of course, this is Absolutely, it goes without saying that this is one of the sticking points for the Iranians, how and the extent to which it's going to be frozen, among other sticking points in that regard.
Tawhid Asadi at the Strait of Hormuz. Thank you so much, Tawhid, for your reporting.